Have you ever wondered why modern monitors are the shape that they are? Have you considered why older slides don't fit modern courtrooms very well? Well, we will be taking a brief but fascinating look into the history of what shaped the modern aspect ratio and led us to the modern widescreen format of today. To understand how the aspect ratio seen in modern courtrooms came to be, we have to look back in time through more than 100 years of screen and film development to Thomas Edison's very first invention for viewing motion pictures. Thomas Edison drew on the talents of a photographer on his staff by the name of W.K. Dickson to help invent a machine to watch motion pictures through a viewing scope. He called this the kinetoscope. Dickson chose to build this machine around a new 35mm flexible film that was produced by Eastman Kodak. Seen here on the right is a handful of frames from the 1894 film The Butterfly Dance. When Dickson was developing the kinetoscope, the width of the 35mm film determined the width of the very first aspect ratio. Dickson needed to choose a height, so he relied on the perforations built into the film to help establish a uniform height of 4 perforations. Amazingly, this arbitrary decision to use 4 perforations led to the beginnings of the first standard aspect ratio in film. It's what we know today as the 4:3 aspect ratio. The 4:3 would become the standard for all movies through the 1940s. Television would then adopt this standard for the next 50 years. Computer monitors would also adopt that 4:3 aspect ratio. It boggles the mind that 129 years ago, the decision of a staff photographer, based upon the number of perforations in a film material, set a standard that was the default for PowerPoint slides up until 2013. Many outdated courtrooms still use 4:3 equipment and require designers to work in this older aspect ratio. By the late 1940s and the early 1950s, the rapid adoption of television sets in the average home had movie studios scrambling to come up with something novel that viewers couldn't experience in their own homes. One of the solutions was to provide a new widescreen view that TV simply could not match. The earliest ideas involved using multiple projectors and projecting onto a curved screen, but the expense and the costly theater setup had movie studios scrambling to use 35mm film and simply fit a widescreen format image onto it. 20th Century Fox was the first to use special lenses that would squeeze a widescreen image onto the standard film. This would then be projected back through another special lens to re-stretch the image to the full size. Fox called this method CinemaScope, and it had this extremely wide 2.35:1 aspect ratio. The first film released in CinemaScope was The Robe. Fox would then go on to release many films in CinemaScope until 1967. Some of the most notable films shot in this aspect ratio are Rebel Without a Cause, East of Eden, The 7-Year Itch, and A Star is Born. In fact, the modern film La La Land was shot in CinemaScope aspect ratio as a tribute to those musicals of the 1950s. As amazing as CinemaScope was, it wasn't without its flaws. The fixed anamorphic element caused close-up shots of the actors' faces to stretch. So Paramount began to develop a different method of shooting on 35mm. They wanted to do this in order to create a higher resolution image without any of the distortion problems. Paramount's new method did not use a squeezed anamorphic image. Instead, they rotated the 35mm film in the camera gate and shot onto an area of 8 perforations instead of 4. Paramount called this VistaVision. It was also nicknamed Lazy 8 because of its strange orientation and its 8 frames. This created an aspect ratio of 1.85:1. Shown here is the introduction sequence of the very first VistaVision film. It was introduced to the public at Radio City Music Hall in October of 1954. Alfred Hitchcock also famously used VistaVision for many of his films such as Vertigo and North by Northwest. Lazy 8 is still occasionally used in portions of modern films. You may have seen them in The Dark Knight and Inception. Next, during the late 1950s, Hollywood filmmakers began to consider the idea that changing to a naturally wider film type, such as 65mm stock, would provide an even higher quality viewing experience. The first system to release this format was Todd AO, and the second was MGM Camera 65, licensed by Panavision. Panavision became one of the earliest leaders in the production of 65mm systems. And it introduced its Super Panavision 70, which used spherical lenses with 65mm to create a final aspect ratio of 2.2 to 1. I'm certain that many people are familiar with the early films shot using Super Panavision 70. Some of those notable films were West Side Story, My Fair Lady, 2001: A Space Odyssey, and as shown here, the sweeping cinematics used in Lawrence of Arabia. The history of all these varied aspect ratios may be very interesting, but how do they relate to the 16:9 slide format? Starting as far back as the 1980s, the Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers began searching for that next suitable aspect ratio for an emerging high-definition broadcast format. Dr. Kern Powers at the SMPTE Group began the task of coming up with a new aspect ratio. He did this by first reviewing the most widely used aspect ratios that we just discussed. The first thing that Dr. Powers decided to do was to normalize the aspect ratios to each other. He did this by making each rectangle have the same area, regardless of their respective width and height. These new normalized rectangles were then laid over the top of each other one by one with their center points aligned. Using this new layout of rectangles laid over the top of each other, Dr. Powers found that he could trace the outlines of the most extreme width and height of these common aspect ratios and produce a common rectangle with an aspect ratio of 1.77 to 1. This new outer boundary of 1.77 to 1 is more commonly known as 16:9, and it is the dimensions of your widescreen televisions and the monitors you find in modern courtrooms today. Interestingly, the inner rectangle of the overlays is also 16:9. This inner rectangle is known as a shoot and protect area. Designing the most important area of the slides within this inner rectangle will help create slides that are more easily transferred back and forth between 4:3 and 16:9. Taking that 16:9 and creating a grid of equal units can be a useful tool when establishing slide layouts. Here, you can note the yellow outline on the grid positions as it fades into this common callout slide format. You can see the grid system successfully being used to establish appropriate units of division for the title bar height, the spacing between elements, and the page and callout elements themselves. It's a common misconception that research supports the golden ratio as the most well-liked visual layout tool. In fact, many researchers have debunked those earliest study findings regarding the golden ratio. However, researchers have discovered that viewers prefer layouts broken down into equal internal divisions such as the 16:9 grid shown here. There is nothing new or groundbreaking about using grid systems. Grid systems have long been a standard researched and taught to artists, designers, photographers, and those specializing in user interface. This landmark text by Mueller-Brockman helps define the grid system uses to enable audiences to read more quickly and better understand and retain information. In fact, IBM's internal design specifications source Mueller-Brockman as the inspiration for their 2x2 grid system. IBM employs this grid system for layout decisions from widescreen video, business cards, and they even apply it to things as far-reaching as office space layouts. The IBM 2x2 system divides spaces in half, and it establishes some of the same vertical grids as the 16:9 grid system. Shown here as the yellow box and grid fade into this section header slide, there are several common layouts where this system can be successfully employed. The grid system here again establishes a pleasing title bar space that takes up minimal space. It also establishes a divider for graphical representations of organizations versus the text layout. This same layout is also commonly used for testimony slides. I'll leave you here with one last example. Here you can see the common comparison slide. Comparisons are commonly made between plaintiff and defense-oriented points, and the grid system establishes clean margins, pleasing layouts, and an excellent use of space and white space. To wrap up, the history of the modern aspect ratio and how to use it best for litigation graphics is an extremely interesting thought exercise. It's important, however, to not let the grid system be the absolute defining factor in information graphic design. There are many, many instances where it's better to sacrifice form in order to achieve function, especially when it concerns font sizes and readability in the courtroom. Creatively breaking that grid system is also an excellent way to use visual signaling to grab the attention to focal parts of the slide. I hope that this history and simple tips are useful and you find a way to incorporate them into your next slide design.